Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Molly, and on behalf of the Working Class Project and peoplesworld.org, we'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on the immigration crisis, a conversation with Professor Juan Gonzalez. Thank you again for coming. And next, Elias.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elias, and as mentioned, we'd like to welcome everyone to this important webinar titled The Immigration Crisis, a Conversation with Juan Gonzalez. Eric Gersowitz, our next moderator, will be giving a brief introduction to Professor Juan Gonzalez and his background. Then, Professor Gonzalez will be giving a presentation today on the subject of the immigration crisis. Unfortunately, Professor Gonzalez is not feeling too well due to COVID, so we ask that everyone please be respectful of time. After the presentation, we will be accepting questions from the audience. Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Elias. Professor Juan Gonzalez was a staff columnist for New York's The Daily News for nearly 30 years, has been a co-host since 1996 of the morning news show Democracy Now!, and was the Richard D. Hefner Professor of Communications and Public Policy at Rutgers University from 2017 to 2023. He is currently a senior research fellow at Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His investigative reports on the labor movement, environmental justice, race relations, urban policy, and Latin America have garnered numerous accolades, including 2 George Polk Awards for commentary, and he became in 2015 the first Latino to be inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame by the Society of Professional Journalists Deadline Club. He is the author of 5 books, including the classic Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, 2001, which became the basis of an award-winning 2012 feature documentary film narrated by Professor Gonzalez, and which is now in its 3rd edition. His News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media, 2011, which he co-authored with Joseph Torres, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. His Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities, 2017, examines the rise of progressive elected officials in cities across the United States and their efforts to revise urban policies. Over the years, more than 24 films and documentaries have featured Professor Gonzalez as a figure or expert commentator, including the landmark PBS series Latino Americans, 2013, the PBS documentary 9/11's Unsettled Dust, 2021, the CNN series 1968, The Year That Changed America, 2018, HBO Max's docuseries Menudo, Forever Young, 2022, the Rick Burns History of Latino New York, Nueva York, 2010, the PBS biography Roberto Clemente, 2008, and Spike TV's Viva Baseball, 2005. A founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Professor Gonzalez developed in 2002, while serving as the group's president, an innovative effort to build partnerships between mainstream media companies and local Latino community leaders aimed at improving coverage of those communities and hiring and promoting more Latinx journalists. The initiative, known as the Parity Project, garnered more than $1.5 million in grants from the McCormick Tribune Foundation and the Knight Foundation to expand to more than a dozen cities. Even before he entered journalism, the young Professor Gonzalez was a well-known 1960s activist as a key figure of the Columbia University Student Revolt of 1968, as a member of Students for a Democratic Society, and later as a leader and founding member of the New York branch of the militant revolutionary Puerto Rican group, the Young Lords, and a first president of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. Born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, he was raised in East Harlem and Brooklyn, New York, and received his BA from Columbia University, and we are so honored that Professor Juan Gonzalez has agreed to join us this evening. Welcome, Professor Gonzalez.
Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. As I mentioned earlier to the organizers, I'm a little under the weather with COVID, but hopefully I won't cough too much during this session, and we'll be able to get through it. I was invited to speak, basically, I guess, on about a report that we issued at the Great Cities Institute just about a week ago, which looks at the current migrant crisis in the US. And I want to emphasize the word current because we've had repeated migrant crises in the United States now for probably about 60, 70 years. But of course, since this isn't a nation of immigrant settlers, there have been repeated immigration crises throughout American history. This most recent one, though, is which we focus on in the report, has to deal with basically the last 3 or 4 years of what has been happening in the United States. Those of you who are in some of the major northern cities or who are watching or listening to this webinar along the southwest border know that there have been continuing crises. But now suddenly in New York, in Chicago, in Denver, and Philadelphia, and some of the major northern cities, about a year or two ago, the migrant buses sent by the governors of Texas and Florida to these cities have really brought the crisis home to cities that didn't really experience it at this level, other than those that are along the border. And of course, I've been along the border numerous times, and all the cities there, whether it's San Diego, El Paso, Mexicali, Brownsville, McAllen, Laredo, all of these cities have been confronting the crisis of the broken immigration system that this country has been operating under now for decades. But the most recent crisis has been the flood of the new asylum seekers who have been shipped north by the governors of Texas and Florida and others who have accompanied them as well, those who have crossed the border. What this report tries to show is, number one, these various crises, while they have a long-term root cause, they manifest themselves in different ways, depending on the particular years. For instance, for decades, the largest migrant group crossing into the United States were of Mexican nationals. And in fact, as recently as 10 years ago, 60 to 70% of all the undocumented in the country came from Mexico. We began to see a major change occurring during the Obama years and then during the Trump years, where the migration started to shift from largely single men from Mexico to families from Central America, from what some call the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. However, in the last 2 years, the composition of the migration has changed dramatically. And that is what this report especially focuses on. There's been and before I get to that, I wanted to raise one other aspect of this, which is that the northern cities have been overwhelmed by the number of migrants as they try to provide them housing, basic services, and healthcare. But at the same time that this has been happening, there's been another migration occurring of Ukrainians to the United States. Now, I didn't get into that in this report, but I have expressed a viewpoint or analysis of this as well. There have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that have entered the United States since the war in Ukraine began. And here in Chicago, for example, we are now facing a migrant crisis where people are sleeping in police stations. They're sleeping on the streets. The city is trying everything it can to come up with housing for the migrants who have arrived, largely from the southwest border, who number at this point about 17,000. Now, I know New York City had about 100,000 or over 100,000, but Chicago has had 17,000 come into the city in the last year and a half. Well, there have been 29,000 applications from the Chicago area for Ukrainian to be admitted not only into the United States but directly to Chicago. And as of May of last year, 21,000 of them had already been admitted. My suspicion is by now all 29,000 have been. So far more Ukrainians have come to the Chicagoland area in the last year than all of the migrants that have been coming from the southwest border. Yet there are no Ukrainians sleeping in police stations. There are no Ukrainians sleeping in temporary housing. There are no Ukrainians in need of shelter or support. Well, why is that? Well, because the Biden administration, in its funding for the war in Ukraine, also set aside over $600 million to assist Ukrainians who were coming into the United States and receiving humanitarian parole. So the Ukrainians who come into the United States receive automatically have the benefit of Medicaid, relocation assistance, SSI, job training, education. All of these are provided by the federal government as part of the war on Ukraine budget. So that the Ukrainians are basically being quietly integrated into American societies, which shows you that it's not a question of can the country take so many people coming in. It's a question of what are the resources allocated? How does the government choose to allocate its resources? But anyways, I said there've been, I think the number of migrants in Chicago now is still not reached the number of Ukrainians that have come in. But everyone focuses on the migrant crisis, and especially on the fact that there are so many Venezuelans, which is highly unusual. There's never been a large Venezuelan migration to the United States until the last few years. So when we began to look at the Department of Homeland Security statistics on who is being intercepted at the border and who is being given parole into the United States pending their adjudication of their asylum requests, we began to realize that the bulk of the migration surge is coming from three countries. It's coming from Venezuela, it's coming from Cuba, and it's coming from Nicaragua. Right? In fact, almost as many Cubans have been intercepted and arrested, detained at the border, and then led into the United States as Venezuelans over the past 2 years. It's like, I have the statistics in the report. I think it's 450,000 Venezuelans and 400,000 Cubans, and then several 100,000 Nicaraguans. What these three countries that represent the bulk of the new surge, in fact, among asylum requests for the first 11 months of FY 2023, which obviously the federal government goes from October 1 to September 30th. So the first 11 months of the 2023 fiscal year, which ended on September 30th, half of all the asylum requests from countries all around the world to the United States Department of Homeland Security came from those three countries. So why is that? Well, what we conclude is that these are the only three countries in Latin America where the United States is currently involved in economic warfare. It has been involved for years. Well, when it comes to Cuba, for decades, in an embargo of all trade with Cuba. With Venezuela, it was especially ramped up in during the Trump administration, began under the Obama administration, and was really ramped up under the Trump administration, and has been largely maintained by the Biden administration. And Nicaragua began to be sanctioned as well by the Trump administration. So all three are being subjected to economic warfare. And it's our contention that this is a key factor in why we are suddenly receiving so many migrants from countries that that previously, for instance, even the Cuban migration. More Cubans have come to the United States in the last 2 years than ever in American history, right? More than came after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, more than came during the Mariel boat lift of 1980, more than came during the Balsero crisis of 1994. This is the largest surge of Cubans coming to the United States in American history. The difference is that the Cubans are not going all over the country like the Venezuelans are to different parts of the country. Most of the Cuban migrants are going to Florida. And because there is an established 75% of all Cubans who enter the United States have been going to Florida. So there's an established and relatively prosperous Cuban community in Florida, and they have been able to facilitate the integration of these Cuban asylum seekers into the population, and the rest of the country is not even aware that this is happening. So that this is the key thing to understand. People are wondering why suddenly are all these migrants arriving in such historic numbers? Well, it's because our country has been waging economic warfare against these three particular countries. The Venezuela one, I think we get into in most detail because that's the one that's been the most, the newest form of economic warfare. And what we conclude, for instance, is that the United States government has been trying to do regime change in Venezuela now for almost 20 years, since Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. The Bush administration backed an original coup attempt against Chavez that failed. It then began to cut off any arms sales to Venezuela. But Venezuela pretty much continued to prosper under Hugo Chavez. And in fact, all the economic indicators, the country's gross domestic product increased dramatically. It dramatically lowered poverty. It improved healthcare. And the country was actually, despite hostility from the United States, was continuing to function relatively well, thanks to the fact that Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and that Chavez was able, as a charismatic leader, was able to gain wide popularity, not only within the country, but also across Latin America. However, once Chavez died and his successor, Nicolás Maduro, was elected president, his election was with a very slim margin, and there were new efforts attempted by the United States to see if the Bolivarian revolution could be turned back. So you had more and more public protests, a lot of it funded by the National Endowment for Democracy to stir up civil society groups against the Maduro government. And most importantly, you had the beginning of sanctions. President Obama in 2014 issued an executive order claiming that the situation in Venezuela had become a threat to the national security of the United States. Now, how exactly Venezuela could be a threat to the U.S. security is a little bit incredible to consider, but that's what Obama decided. And subsequently, the executive order wasn't made public until March of 2015. And the first sanctions against Venezuela began, but they really weren't ramped up until Donald Trump came into office. And Trump really began to institute a draconian set of sanctions. It included, for instance, Venezuela had been shipping a huge portion of its oil to the United States. And gradually the Trump administration cut off all purchases of Venezuelan oil into the United States. It essentially ordered all American companies and investors out. They could only remain investing in Venezuela if Washington approved it. They vetoed all international loans from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the Latin American Bank, Development Bank, because the United States has veto power in all of these institutions on loans. So Venezuela was cut off from credit. It joined together with the Bank of England, with the British government to freeze $2 billion in gold reserves that Venezuela had in the Bank of England. So it's Venezuela's gold, but it's held in the Bank of England, and that was frozen as well. And most importantly, it froze the assets of Citgo Petroleum. Now, I know many of you have probably seen Citgo gas stations all around the United States. Citgo is an American oil company and one of the top 10 oil companies in the United States, but it's owned by the Venezuelan government. It's owned by the National Oil Company of Venezuela. And in 2022, Citgo had $24 billion in revenue, 2.8 million in profit, 2.8 billion in profit. None of that money can go to Venezuela because it's all been frozen by the, it was frozen by the Trump administration. It continues to be frozen. So basically, the United States has been strangling the Venezuelan economy. And the Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs did a report on the sanctions, and he concluded that, quote, U.S. sanctions have inflicted and increasingly inflict very serious harm to human life and health, including an estimated more than 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018. Just in those 2 years, the sanctions had led to more than 40,000 deaths. So the result has been two things have happened in Venezuela. Number one is the Venezuelan economy has gone through the greatest economic contraction in the history of Latin America. Right? It's seen a 74% drop in its GDP. And as a result of the total devastation of the country, and as well as the political turmoil that's been resulting from repeated U.S. attempts to destabilize the government there, 7 million people have left the country, and so it's a mass flight that is really incomprehensible. It's been as big as the flight of Ukrainians out of Ukraine following the Russian invasion there, and most of those Venezuelans have gone to Colombia, they've gone to Ecuador, they've gone to Peru, they've gone to Brazil, they've gone to these other countries. But interestingly, after the start of the Ukraine war, a lot of the international assistance that was going to help those Venezuelans who had fled in those countries has dried up. And so it's no surprise that the Venezuelans who had left the country were thinking, well, I can maybe survive in Colombia, or I can survive in Brazil, or I can survive in Ecuador, suddenly started crossing the into Central America and up into the United States. So that's been, I think, the crux of the matter. The Cuban migration situation can also be traced to the increased sanctions that occurred because, as you all remember, President Obama, toward the end of his second term, has finally decided to ease the embargo with Cuba, establish relations, diplomatic relations, and there was beginning to be a thaw in the relations between Cuba and the United States. But once the Trump administration came in, they immediately undid everything that Obama had done. They canceled the rights of Cubans in the United States to send money back to their relatives in Cuba, remittances. They once again declared Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism. The result was a sharp drop in tourism that had begun to build up from the United States to Cuba. And then, of course, when COVID came in, when the pandemic came in, Cuba had depended largely on tourism from the rest of the world. That dried up. And so Cuba has been in enormous economic contraction as a result of the reimposed sanctions that came in under Trump and that have been pretty much maintained under the Biden administration. So the Cubans felt increasingly need to leave because they couldn't survive. However, one thing that assisted them in being able to leave was that the Trump administration had also imposed sanctions on Nicaragua, on the Ortega government in Nicaragua. And President Ortega responded by eliminating visa restrictions for any Cuban who wanted to come to Nicaragua. So what happened then at that point was that Cubans who typically had used small boats to cross the Florida Straits to try to get into the United States, but as the Coast Guard got more efficient at stopping them, found it harder and harder to do so. All that Cubans had to do was fly into Managua in Nicaragua, and then they could go up through Mexico into the US, and that's exactly what happened. The Department of Homeland Security reports that in the 1 year after Ortega eliminated visa requirements for Cubans into Nicaragua, over 200,000 Cubans entered the southwest border of the United States. Unprecedented. And then this year, it's been about 180,000. So it's been over 400,000 in the last 2 years. So the same thing happened with Nicaragua. The sanctions imposed on Nicaragua by the Trump administration. Very few Nicaraguans had been coming to the United States, for not since the civil wars of the 1980s had any large numbers of Nicaraguans come to the United States. People came from Honduras, they came from El Salvador, they came from Guatemala. Very few came from Nicaragua. But then when the Trump administration started to clamp down on sanctions, those Nicaraguans who did leave the country tended to go to Costa Rica. And in fact, there was close to 400,000 Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. But Costa Rica began to clamp down on asylum seekers, and that's when you started seeing more and more Nicaraguans coming north. So the main, I guess, takeaway from our report is that our government policy in Latin America over the last decade or so has been fueling the very migration crisis that all the rest of us in the United States are trying to figure out. How did this happen? Why is this suddenly so? Why has this surge occurred, and why has it been for these particular countries? But we also go into the report to the long-term roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem are simply that the United States has, throughout its, for the past 200 years, treated Latin America as an area to pillage and extract resources from. This December will be the 200th anniversary of the President James Monroe's proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to the European powers, and in essence was our sphere of influence. And clearly, those of you who have studied history know that there was repeated multiple interventions of Latin America by the American military throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And then that those interventions continued subsequent to World War II. And we list just a few of those. The 1954 CIA-sponsored coup against the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, the 1961 CIA-financed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, the 65 invasion of the Dominican Republic by US troops to crush a popular revolt against a military dictatorship. And that was the second military intervention in the DR. There was one in 1916 that lasted till 1924. There was a 1973 coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, also supported by the CIA. There was the Reagan administration's illegal arming of the Contras rebels in the 1980s against Nicaragua's democratically elected Sandinista government. There was the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama and the overthrow of its president, Manuel Noriega. There was the 2002 failed coup that I mentioned against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And there was the support in 2009 of the right-wing coup against the democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, in Honduras. So there's a long string of interventions in the politics and regime change efforts by the U.S. government in Latin America, while at the same time there's been complete neglect of the economic crisis and social dislocation of the region. There are 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States total foreign aid to all those 33 countries last year was $3 billion. For all the countries, $3 billion. The biggest part of it went to Colombia, and the most of that money went for the drug interdiction program of the Colombian government. And so $3 billion for a region that has 650 million people, a third of them living in poverty. That's how much value the United States placed in foreign aid to Latin America. To put that into context, we just provided Ukraine $113 billion in the last year and a half for its war, and President Biden is proposing another $61 billion in his new package that he's proposing to Congress right now. So he's looking at like close to $200 billion in aid to Ukraine, whereas Latin America, the entire region has gotten $3 billion. Latin America gets less money than Israel gets annually, and Israel just has 9 million people and is a wealthy and prosperous country. One statistic that we showed is that the United States was giving more foreign aid to Latin America in the 1960s, more than twice as much. It was giving the equivalent of $7 billion in aid under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations than it is giving today. And the region was maybe, had half the population that it has today. So there's been two policies for Latin America: intervene against any government that doesn't do what we tell it to do, and ignore the needs, the economic needs of the masses of the Latin American people. So that's what's been the resulting, has resulted in this constant migration wave as people from Latin America are unable to survive and have no choice but to head northward. So what do? We continue not to fix our immigration system, but we do spend money on interdicting people and on a whole new wing of the prison industrial complex, which is the immigration detention complex. I'm going to leave you with one figure that really stunned me. Between 2003, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, right, that was after the 9/11 attacks, and 2021, the United States spent $333 billion on agencies that carry out immigration enforcement. I want to repeat that: $333 billion on the agencies that conduct immigration enforcement. Whether it's the walls that Trump tried to build and others, there would start with the surveillances, the drones, the the increases in Border Patrol and ICE agents, $333 billion. And today we have more migrants crossing the border than at any time in history. If you want to look at a colossal failure, border enforcement has been a colossal failure. And yet the the Biden administration is putting in another $14 billion in this new proposal for more border enforcement. And the Republicans in Congress want to spend more on border enforcement. It doesn't work. It's the same thing as you lock people up or the war on drugs. You're attacking the symptoms of the problem. You're not attacking the root causes of the problem, which is the enormous disparity in income and wealth between our Latin American neighbors and the United States. So I'll leave it there. And if you have any questions, be glad to answer.
Thank you, Professor. So we are going to open the floor for questions and comments. We would love to invite everyone in attendance to contribute and introduce a question or comment. We are looking for raised hands. Cameron Orr.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for joining us. I really appreciate it. I was wondering if you might be able to also give some information about what's going on in some of the other areas in Central, if you have the information, that has driven immigration from some of the Central American countries, like El Salvador or Honduras or Guatemala. If that information is not available, no problem.
Yeah, well, we didn't get into it in this report because we wanted to concentrate on the immediate problem. But the reality is that in my book, and I recommend those of you who haven't read it to read my book, Harvest of Empire: History of Latinos in America. I go in pretty deeply into the whole situation with Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There are a variety of reasons why there was a sudden surge during the Obama years. For Hondurans, it was pretty easy. There was a coup in 2009 that deposed Manuel Zelaya as president. That brought a reign of terror into Honduras. Anybody who was in opposition to the government at the time was hunted down and either jailed or killed. And in fact, one of the presidents that followed after that coup is now in jail for drug trafficking. He's on drug trafficking charges. And his brother, who was the speaker of, who was a major figure in the Honduran Senate during that period, they were both leaders of the coup. His brother's already been convicted of drug trafficking. So there was a right-wing narco state that was installed in Honduras, and that created so much insecurity that a lot of people left the country. El Salvador, you've heard a lot about the gang situations in El Salvador. What most people don't know is that most of those gangs were really created in the United States. They were young Salvadorans who grew up in LA and San Diego and other places, never been to El Salvador, but they got jailed at one point or another and were sent back to El Salvador and then replicated their gangs there and created a reign of terror in El Salvador. In Guatemala, the big problem was, I think the Guatemalans, along with the Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria, were the first really climate refugees that the United States has confronted. In Guatemala, there's a whole dry corridor of the country that has been under really extreme drought now for many years, and many of the peasants in the country there, who are mostly Maya, have not been able to survive and have fled northward. But that was the situation then. The Honduras situation, I think, ever since a change of government and a more democratic government came into power, we've begun to see a real reduction of the migration flow from Honduras compared to what it was back in during the Obama years and the Trump years. But this report focuses primarily on the most recent migrant crisis of Cubans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans.
David?
Hi, yes. My name is David. I'm part of the South LA Club of the party. I'm also the son of Vietnamese Chinese refugees from Vietnam from the 80s. But as a socialist in the party, I am curious on if you have any suggestions on how those who are from the refugee communities that have opposing politics of our homeland, do you have any suggestions on how we can maybe unpack whatever refugee trauma that might perpetuate the narrative of pro-US imperialism, like what you brought up before around the Cuban community? And in my observation, there's some similarities with the Cuban refugee community as with the Vietnamese refugee community in the US. Hope that question was something that was articulated well for you to understand. Thank you for your time there, Professor.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer the question to your satisfaction, but I will note that there are in all migrations of peoples, and of course the entire world is in a migrant crisis. When the United States is not the only country facing the situation right now, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, all those countries, Spain, they're all facing migration crises of their own. And generally speaking, the migrants and the refugees come precisely from the countries that were at one time dominated by the particular receiving nation. You know, the reason there's so many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans in France is because those were the colonies of France in the late 19th and early 20th century. The reason there's so many Pakistanis, Indians, and Jamaicans in England is because those were the colonies of England. And the reason there's so many Indonesians in the Netherlands, if any of you have been to the Netherlands, you'll notice that there is a considerable non-white population that has developed in the Netherlands because that was a colony of the Netherlands. So I think that people generally, and what's happened recently in Europe is that the migrant flows across the Mediterranean into Europe. Who's coming? People from Yemen, from Syria, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from the very countries that the Western powers have, from Libya, the very countries that the Western powers intervened in or invaded or waged war against are now coming to the very countries that were responsible for the destabilization of their countries. So it's there's a class character to migration as well. One of the interesting facts that we, and I think this refers to what you were saying about the Vietnamese, that we uncovered about the Venezuelan migrants is that it's a highly educated population. 62% of all the Venezuelans who have come to the United States since 2017 have a bachelor's degree or higher. Now, only 35% of US adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. Only 34% of other immigrants who come to the United States have a bachelor's degree or higher. Yet 62% of the Venezuelans have a bachelor's degree or higher. That's it. That indicates that it's an educated, professional refugee population. And very similar, I suspect, and we'll know in a few years when more studies are done, to the Cubans who came after the Cuban Revolution, and others who have escaped social revolutions in their own countries. I'm sure the Afghans that have come to the United States because they're only admitting those who were connected to the U.S. military or who worked for the U.S. military in one way or other are probably a more upper class migration. So migration is not just of nationalities, it's also often of classes. And so all migrants are not the same. And when they come, they're going to bring whatever baggage or ideas they had with them. So I suspect that most of the Venezuelans, once they settle, are not going to be as liberal or progressive as let's say Hondurans or El Salvadorans or Mexicans. But that doesn't mean that you don't assist them in their time of need, but it's to understand that there's not only a nationality migrating, there is a class of people that's migrating. And that's something that needs to be addressed as well.
Thank you, Professor. So we are going to close the question and answer or comment period and turn it to you for closing remarks. I was wondering if you might include some insight around credible solutions that working class people in this country could help to bring about. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I think, well, clearly, when it comes to the migration crisis, the key issue, and it's not being addressed by Congress, is the issue of immigration, comprehensive immigration reform. The country has been trying now for almost 20 years to redo the immigration laws, ever since the big immigration protests of 2006 and President Bush's attempt in 2007 to rewrite the immigration law. It's continually failed. It's continually failed because comprehensive immigration reform is not just another law. It will determine who legitimately gets to be an American citizen in the United States of the 21st century. And that's why reactionary forces in Congress don't want to address the problem, because they know that any form of legalization will admit into citizenship a whole group of people who will not be able to replicate the political status quo that exists today. So that's why the fight has taken so long. However, there's things that can be done in the meantime. One is end the embargoes, the economic warfare against Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. That will dramatically reduce the migration flow from those countries. The other thing that people don't realize is that the United States needs more immigrants, needs more migrants. As we note in the report, the Department of Labor has reported just recently that there are 10 million unfilled jobs in the United States today. If all of the unemployed went to work, excuse me, tomorrow, there'd still be 4 million unfilled jobs in the United States. So this country has a labor shortage, which is going to continue to grow as more and more baby boomers pass through their retirement and into nursing homes. And so you're going to see an increasing labor shortage in the country. And that has to be filled by immigration. It's not being filled by reproduction. So it's in the country's interest to open the doors, to let more people in, and especially to let the 11 million undocumented that are already here. You don't have to give them citizenship, just give them work permits. You know, if you're worried about them voting you out of office, just give them work permits. They'll be satisfied with that for now, to at least be able to not to come out from under the shadows. So I think that those are the two main things. One is end the blockade. Two is provide some federal assistance to these cities, like we're giving to the Ukrainians, for integrating these people into the country. Give work permits to those people who are already here. And the other thing is that we have to sharply increase foreign aid to Latin America. This 3 billion stuff doesn't work. It's not going to do anything. We need to sharply increase foreign aid to Latin America. Those are things that you could advocate to your elected officials and in your organizing to demand.
Thank you. And did you have any final closing comments?
No, that's it for me.
Excellent. So we appreciate everyone for attending today. And again, thank you, Professor Juan Gonzalez, for joining us and sharing your wisdom and insight and knowledge. Thank you all again. And on behalf of the Working Class Project and the People's World, we say good night.
Good night.
Also, we'd like to say, Professor Gonzalez, we'd like to invite you back in the near future.
Okay, well, maybe I'll be feeling a little better then. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Thanks.
sir.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.